Hello, everybody. What you're about to hear is an episode from an audio course that I've spent the last couple of months creating and is now available. So if you're interested, you can keep listening on and I'll tell you what the course is about and what it is, and then I'll get into the episode. Recently, I've spent a lot of time thinking about a question. How is it possible for seemingly ordinary and normal people to support evil regimes, or be corrupted by terrible ideas, or be enticed to commit violent acts, or merely to stand by and watch, doing nothing as the unthinkable happens around them? I've always been fascinated by this question, especially as modern events play out in real time. So, using the case study of Nazi Germany as a guide, I spent the last couple of months researching into this question, and the result is an audio course that's now available on Avid. The course is called A Beginner's Guide to Understanding and Resisting Fascism, Nazi Germany and the Battle for the Human Heart. It's 13 episodes, hours of content, with readings and recommendations to go along with the course. In it, you'll explore questions like, to what extent did the average German support fascism and support the Nazi Party? For those who supported it, or tacitly condoned it, or stood by as injustice happened, why? Was it fear? Was it propaganda, obedience, brainwashing, or something else? I wanted to find the answers to these questions of how ordinary people are enticed by these violent and dangerous ideas. So in the course, you'll learn about what fascism is, how ordinary people responded to the politics of fear and the police state. You'll learn about Nazi propaganda, the response of the education system and religion to the Nazi regime, the Nazification of politics and culture, examples and psychological characteristics of both bystanders and resistors. You'll learn about the gradual normalization of the absurd and more. I think the conclusions I came to are pretty interesting and pretty surprising. And I think if you like this podcast and you're listening to this right now, chances are you'll enjoy the course. I'm proud of it, put a lot of time and effort into it, and I think it's worthwhile, especially in the moment we find ourselves in. I'm donating 20% of all the proceeds from the course to GiveWell's Maximum Impact Fund, which allocates donations to the highest rated and most effective charities directed to the people around the world who need help the most. So if you're interested in the course, or you want a little more context to current events going on in the world right now, or you just want to support a good cause, you can sign up for the course at avid.fm/reflectinghistory. There's a link in the show notes if you want to click through there. If you don't like the course for any reason, within 1 year, you can get a full refund, no questions asked. Again, that's avid.fm/reflectinghistory. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks for the support. In the early 1950s, the world was still picking up the pieces, literally, from the destruction and chaos of World War II. One of the questions that people were asking was, how is it possible that ordinary people, seemingly human beings like you and I, could have supported Hitler and gone along with his murderous agenda? Was there something about German people in particular? Was there a German spirit that was capable of leading people towards ideologies of violence and terror? German-American Milton Mayer had a different but somewhat more insidious theory. He believed that ideologies like fascism and Nazism hinge on the support and gradual habituation of normal, everyday people, what he called the little men. And he believed that rather than this being a uniquely German situation, anybody could be radicalized. Take an ordinary person, pull the appropriate levers and switches, provide the right context, and put them in the right situation, and any ordinary person could find themselves supporting or tacitly condoning the unthinkable. Referring to his journey in post-war Germany, Mayer said, quote, "I felt and feel that it was not German man that I had met, but man. He happened to be in Germany under certain conditions. He might be here under certain conditions. He might, under certain conditions, be I. If I, and my countrymen, ever succumbed to that concatenation of conditions, no constitution, no laws, no police, and certainly no army would be able to protect us from harm. For there is no harm that anyone else can do to a man that he cannot do to himself, no good that he cannot do if he will. And what was said long ago is true. Nations are made not of oak and rock, but of men. And as the men are, so will the nations be." End quote. Maybe the harshest and scariest reality of the Third Reich was that the Nazis were people, just like you and I. And perhaps, under the right conditions, it could have been us. So this German-American journalist, Milton Mayer, wanted to understand the conditions in which the so-called little man could potentially be involved in the development of fascism and authoritarian evil. And he wanted to know, once everything was said and done, to what extent do these ordinary people avoid moral responsibility for the role they played or didn't play in these horrific events? Do people take responsibility for what they did? Do they deflect it on somebody else? Do they avoid the question entirely? All interesting questions. In the early 1950s, Milton Mayer decided that he was going to go to Germany and live with some of these former Nazis in the hopes of uncovering the answers to these questions and determining just how normal and ordinary these people were. Describing the project, he said, quote, "My discovery in January and February 1952 of 10, quote-unquote, little National Socialists, widely diversified in upbringing, religion, temperament, native intelligence, occupation, and personal situation during the rise of Nazism, persuaded my colleagues and me that the project should be revised. I should study these 10 subjects as intimately as possible during the 6 succeeding months, reduce their life stories, including their own view of their lives, to written form, and draw conclusions from the picture, which altogether they presented." End quote. This is a version of oral history. Mayer was basically going to go to a town in Germany, live in the town for a couple of months, and try to get to know these people who were former Nazis and, again, try to uncover some of the hidden truths of life in the Third Reich. Historian Richard J. Evans talks about Mayer's process. Quote, "Mayer's procedure consisted of a series of social visits to the subjects' homes, where he was invariably offered tea or coffee, or sometimes wine, and eventually, in 8 cases, a meal. If the subjects had children, Mayer would sometimes bring along one of his own to play. If it seemed appropriate, his wife could accompany him. In almost all cases, he also engaged the subject's wife in conversation. Each interview lasted from 2 to 3 hours, with a total of 40 hours being the maximum and 12 the minimum. Given the austerity then reigning in Germany, he brought gifts, token at first, then more substantial, mainly food." End quote. I think it's important to talk about Mayer's interview process here because it underscores the ordinary nature and normality of this whole process. We tend to think of Nazi stormtroopers marching in uniform and brown shirts with evil-looking faces running around beating people up. And of course, there's an element of truth to that, but that's not really what Milton Mayer found here. He's sitting around having tea with members of the Nazi Party, former members, while their children play together. He's sharing a bottle of wine with people who took part in Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, where synagogues were burned, tens of thousands of Jewish people arrested and sent to camps, as many as 2,000 people, historians estimate, killed. Again, what Milton Mayer found in his time living in the town of Marburg in Germany was not rabid, radical, frothing at the mouth Nazis. What he found was ordinary people with families doing ordinary things, but these people had been convinced to go along with something horrible, or if not to go along with it, at least to allow it to become normalized. Mayer himself was a lifelong anti-war, anti-Nazi, anti-communist, relatively middle-of-the-road type of person. Potentially this made him more relatable to the subjects he was interviewing. He didn't mention to them, however, that he was Jewish. And a lot of the conversations that are in this book and that Mayer has with these ordinary people are interesting because obviously he's asking about things related to the Holocaust and the way that Jewish people were treated in the Third Reich. And he felt like if he disclosed that he was Jewish, perhaps he wouldn't get an honest and full answer to some of the questions that he was asking. Mayer also didn't know how to speak German, so there was a translation process. In general, some of the same problems that come up in other types of oral history were present here. So it's not a totally perfect process of historical inquiry, but oral history can be useful and it can help us get at something that other types of history don't really get at. Historian Richard J. Evans also identifies some critiques of Mayer's process, saying that the town of Marburg was not actually totally representative. Mayer makes the claim that the town is sort of a representative sample of people in Germany, but Marburg was actually much more of a Nazi stronghold than most types of towns in Germany. If you look at the demographics and the types of workers and employment that were in the area, there was not a lot of labor organization, not a lot of support for Social Democrats, certainly not a lot of support for the old Communist Party in the Weimar Republic. So you didn't necessarily have a wide variety of diverging opinions politically in the town. Another critique Richard J. Evans makes is that there's no women in this book. Women made up millions of Nazi votes and support, and we heard it in that quote that I referenced earlier from Milton Mayer where he's talking about men. He doesn't say people, he just says men. So to ignore the contribution of women or the role of women in Nazi society, according to Richard J. Evans at least, would be an oversight. This type of thinking, remember this book was published in 1954, not really that uncommon at the time, to think that women didn't play as much a role in political life as men did. Of course, you have a normal critique of oral history that basically says, how do you know that people are actually telling the truth? But there is ways to corroborate information, cross-reference, interviews with documents, and other types of information. Richard J. Evans thinks himself that some of these interview subjects were probably lying about their role in Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, and potentially lying about their awareness of what was happening to Jewish people in their town. But to be honest, this is not a uncommon thing. Another potential limitation of the book was that World War II, which of course was the ultimate product of Nazism, along with the Holocaust, didn't really touch the town of Marburg as deeply as it did other places in Germany. Allied bombing raids didn't really hit the town that often, houses weren't destroyed, civilians weren't killed. So potentially people in that town could plausibly look at the so-called good things that Nazis were doing to put people to work or promote community unity, of course at the expense of people who weren't part of the German Volk, all while overlooking things like the Holocaust and the rest of the chaos from World War II. Out of sight, out of mind. But despite these limitations, the book is still fascinating, and according to Richard J. Evans, quote, "The voices of those whom Mayer interviewed speak to us across the decades in ways that can still provoke and shock. A snapshot of a small sample of Germans in the aftermath of Hitler's Third Reich and World War II, Mayer's book still stands as a timely reminder of how otherwise unremarkable and in many ways reasonable people can be seduced by demagogues and populists, and how they can go along with a regime that commits more and more criminal acts until it plunges itself into war and genocide." End quote. So at the end of the day, what did Mayer find? Why did ordinary people, according to him and according to the people that he studied and interviewed, why would they go along with the Nazi regime? Well, the answer, like all things in Nazi Germany, is complicated. Some people went along simply because they didn't know any better. I think this would characterize large swaths of young people in Nazi Germany, especially elementary school kids, high school kids, members of the Hitler Youth, who may have seen some sort of appeal about the excitement of everything and the nationalism, and maybe even the ways that they could become more important than their parents. Nazi propaganda very often was targeting young people. Hitler himself said many times that propaganda to convince older people is nice, but the real goal is to create an entire system, an entire society that young people are growing up in, so that by the time they become adults, you don't need propaganda anymore. By that point, they have just grown up in a Nazi fascist society and accept it as normal. There's a great exchange between Horstmar Ruprecht, a 14-year-old high school kid, member of the Hitler Youth, and his father. It happens on Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, and it really illustrates a lot of this stuff we've been talking about, and especially the rift between young people who were very supportive of the Nazis and maybe their parents who, in some cases at least, were less enthusiastic. At any rate, Horstmar gets the word that they're going to burn down the synagogue in town, and he asks his dad if he can go watch it, and he's excited about it. The conversation they have next is both sad and revealing. Quote, "Horstmar," said his father. He never called him Horst, and Horst couldn't stand that either. "Do you know what a synagogue is?" "Of course," said Horst. His father was silent. "Tell Papa what it is, son," said the wife, who was afraid of both her husband and her son. "It's the Jews' church," said Horst. "And a church?" said his father. "What is a church, Horstmar?" "A house of God, Pa, golly." "A house of God without the Pa, golly," said his father. "Yes, Pa, a house of God." "God's house?" said his father. "Yes, Pa." "And you, Horstmar, you want to go down and see them burn God's house down?" No, Pa, golly, you don't understand. Are you for the Jews, Pa? Father, mother, and son stood there. No, of course not, son. Of course he's not, said the wife, who was afraid of her husband, of her son, of God, and of Hitler. End quote. With denunciations flying left and right in Nazi Germany, you even had to be careful the opinions you expressed inside of your own family. Aside from the people, especially young people, who may have supported the regime out of some sort of nationalistic excitement, others merely stood by and watched, more concerned with the ordinary things that were happening in their own day-to-day lives. The entire book really is a gripping picture of people basically sleepwalking through brutality and authoritarianism. Going along with it in some cases, yes, because they believed it, but also because it benefited them in some way in an ordinary fashion, like a job or a business opportunity, a sense of moral righteousness, perhaps, complicity, conformity, career reasons. But again, a lot of times when you break down these flashpoint moments like the night of broken glass, what you see is ordinary people, for very ordinary reasons, doing their best to justify what was going on and even to ignore it. Milton Mayer tells the story of Hans Simon, one of the interviewees, a bill collector, casually biking past the scene of the crime where the Jewish synagogue in town had been burned down the night before. He stops, gets off his bike for a second, looks at it, wonders what happened, and then a minute later he starts worrying about his work calls. The banality of evil indeed. Milton Mayer says, quote, "Men think first of the lives they lead and the things they see, and not, among the things they see, of the extraordinary sights, but of the sights which meet them in their daily rounds. The real lives that real people live in a real community have nothing to do with Hitler and Roosevelt, or with what Hitler and Roosevelt are doing. Man doesn't meet the state very often." End quote. What he's saying here is that if you weren't an enemy of the state, if you weren't someone who had already been rounded up for political dissidence or for being Jewish, then your life probably wouldn't have been all that different in Nazi Germany. If you weren't looking for trouble, things could be pretty normal. And if you're continuing to do normal things in your ordinary routine, then you might think to yourself, how bad can things actually be? What's interesting is that the way that ordinary activities can lull you into a sense of complacency, this idea seemed to apply during the Third Reich, but also after, when people were asked to explain what happened. Some people simply refused to believe that something as terrible as the Holocaust could actually happen. Complacency and moral gymnastics and even the cult of Hitler seem to be at play here. Mayer asked one of his interview subjects about the Holocaust, and the response is telling. Quote, "The killing of Jews? Yes, that was wrong. Unless they committed treason in wartime. And of course they did. If I had been a Jew, I would have myself. Still, it was wrong. But some say it happened and some say it didn't. You can show me pictures of skulls or shoes, but that doesn't prove it. But I'll tell you this, it was Himmler. Hitler had nothing to do with it." End quote. In one short paragraph there, you have a person denying the Holocaust, but then saying it happened, but then saying maybe it didn't happen, then saying there's proof, but how do we know the proof is actually real? Then saying perhaps the Jews deserved it because they were committing treason, and then saying that even if it did happen, Hitler, the same guy who micromanaged every aspect of the war effort in World War II, didn't know about it. This all seems absurd to us in hindsight, but we have to remember that there was a cult of personality around the figure of Hitler. He was unassailable. This is one of the key tenets of fascism, that the leader is a sort of father figure, a morally virtuous paragon of hope who is above the fray and above the corruption of ordinary politicians. This is what gives him his mandate to rule. You see this a lot with demagogues and populists and fascist types of leaders as they're spewing out, in Hitler's case, his anti-Semitic nonsense. People are able to ignore the bad parts of it and only focus on the parts that they think are good. Well, he's just speaking his mind. Even if the things that he's speaking are horrible and the content of what he's saying is filled with lies, people said, well, it may not be accurate, but I think he believes it. And that authenticity is somehow preferable to the alternative. Another defense mechanism that Mayer found people using was a sort of shared shirking of responsibility. People heard rumors of what was going on. People saw the night of broken glass for themselves. And they could have delved deeper. They could have asked more questions. They could have gone to lengths to help people who were being persecuted, but they didn't. They were like the guy looking at the ruins of the old Jewish synagogue and then continuing to ride his bike to work. Some people didn't feel that they were responsible. Things were happening too far away from them. People were affected that weren't in their close circle of family or friends, and there was a faded sense of responsibility. And before you wonder how people could know about something like the Holocaust and understand that injustice was happening around them and do nothing, many of the interview subjects draw parallels to what was happening in the United States at the time, in particular with the internment of Japanese Americans in camps. Milton Mayer talks about one conversation he had with an interview subject. Quote, "He asked me whether I had known anybody connected with the West Coast deportation. When I said no, he asked me what I had done about it. When I said nothing, he said triumphantly, 'There, you learned about all these things openly, through your government and your press. We did not learn through ours. As in your case, nothing was required of us. In our case, not even knowledge. You knew about things you thought were wrong. You did think it was wrong, didn't you, Professor?' 'Yes,' I said. 'So, you did nothing. We heard or guessed, and we did nothing. So it is everywhere.' When I protested that the Japanese-descended Americans had not been treated like the Jews, he said, 'And if they had been, what then? Do you not see that the idea of doing something or doing nothing is in either case the same?' End quote. The ordinary Germans in these interviews often made comparisons to the United States, whether it was Japanese internment or whether it was the situation for black people in America, asking Milton Mayer if he ever checked in on his black neighbors or did anything to stop the Japanese internment process. And the answer for Mayer was no. Again, the point is not to compare these different situations and say that they're all the same. The point is, as these German interview subjects are pointing out, that there seems to be something ordinary about not taking responsibility for things happening around you and not stepping up to help when maybe you have the opportunity to do something. Aside from moral justifications and rationalizations that former Nazis made, it seems that there was also organizational and business justifications made by Nazis at the time. A lot of organizations and businesses and volunteer situations were blanketed in to the Nazi Party. Teachers were encouraged to join Nazi teacher unions. Academics were encouraged to attend Nazi conferences. Businesses had Nazi networking events, and so on and so forth. In most cases, you didn't even have to join the party to take part in these organizations. It seemed pretty innocuous, you could help your career, but it's also giving tacit compliance to the Nazi regime, and it's putting your foot in the door for the next thing that the Nazis ask you to do. Or maybe more importantly, don't ask you to do when the time to help comes. Milton Mayer points out that people joined the Nazi Party, and in particular, people joined these Nazi organizations that were co-opted, not necessarily because they believed the ideology, but because they liked to be part of organizations. Or maybe they saw an opportunity, or maybe they wanted to be involved in the community. He says, quote, "In American-occupied Marburg after the war, some of the most enthusiastic organizers of American-supported projects had been among the most enthusiastic organizers of Nazi-supported projects. Some of these people were trying to cover up for past misdeeds or mistakes, but most of them were simply enthusiastic organizers of anybody's supported project. Men joined the party to get a job, or to hold a job, or to get a better job, or to save themselves from getting a worse job, or to get a contract, or to hold a contract, a customer, a client, a patient," end quote. To me, this makes a lot of sense. I think that most people see the world, have a perspective where the decision-making process goes something like this. A person has a thought or has an idea, and then they go out and they act on the idea. So in this case, most people would think, okay, a person has the idea to join the Nazi Party, they believe Nazi ideology, and then they go join the Nazi organizations and the Nazi Party. But what psychology tells us, and what Milton Mayer is telling us about these ordinary Germans, was that the causality was reversed. People didn't join organizations because they were Nazis, they joined organizations because they liked to organize. And once they began doing those actions, once they took part in the ordinary lull of daily Nazi activities, then the ideology and the thoughts come after that. So instead of thought, then action, it's action, then thought. Mayer records an interview with someone saying basically this, that he didn't believe the Nazi ideology, and yet still he was a member of the party. Quote, "Because I was against a one-party state. That was one reason. And I was not a strong nationalist. A Frenchman is a man just as I am. That was another reason. And the race politics didn't make any sense. There is no pure race anymore, and inbreeding is bad anyway. We know that from plants and animals, and from the insanity and feeble-mindedness in villages where everyone is related to everyone else. That was another reason. We talked about all these things in the youth movement when I was young, and I had gone on hikes across the borders a little way into both France and Switzerland. Well, I said, you've given me 3 good reasons for not being a Nazi. And still I was in the party." And he laughed exuberantly, and I with him. End quote. So it was possible to be part of the Nazi Party and not really believe the ideology. And yet, by joining, in some way you're giving tacit support to the regime. Sometimes people joined the party or these party organizations out of fear. Or perhaps they were worried that they would be drafted into the army and have to go fight on the Eastern Front. So people could rationalize it that way by saying, if I join this organization, it will help me keep a steady job, and then I won't have to go fight on the Eastern Front. Speaking of the Eastern Front, many, especially early in the Third Reich, saw Nazism as the only way to combat communism. And if your main political goal was to see the Communist Party lose, then guess what? The Nazis are your party. Mission accomplished. There simply were no communists left, at least openly, in Nazi Germany by the mid-1930s. Of course, this was achieved with violence and brutality, but the Nazis were effective nonetheless. Many of the ordinary Germans that Milton Mayer interviewed expressed concern about communism. Many were religious as well. Religion in the Third Reich is a complicated topic, as we discussed earlier in the course, but the tenet in the Nazi Party platform about positive Christianity appealed to many. And of course, the Nazis were trying to appeal to religious people on purpose. And at the time, many religious groups, many religious organizations, many religious people viewed communism as atheism, which would of course be the enemy for something like Christianity. If people wanted to reach for it, they could use religion as a justification for supporting the Nazis, at least early on in the Third Reich. Hitler and the Nazis would show their true colors in regards to religion much later on. It does seem that the Christians who Milton Mayer interviewed here had a level of anti-Semitism that was concerning. And it's worth noting that it wasn't necessarily beliefs and thoughts that manifested as the anti-Semitism, it was actions. Maybe it was not paying a tab at a Jewish restaurant. Maybe it was turning a blind eye as Jewish families were deported. Maybe it was waiting for the train at the train station with a Jewish person and then going in a separate car when the doors opened. When Milton Mayer asked the ordinary Germans he interviewed about this type of thing, they often, in a strange way, found themselves as the victims. He says, quote, "Men, too, have a way of dating their guilt and innocence from the injuries they suffer, not from those they inflict. No matter how far back in history I went with my National Socialist friends, they would want to begin its writing with their own or their country's agonies. When I spoke of 1939, they spoke of 1945. When I spoke of 1914, they spoke of 1918. When I spoke of 1871, they spoke of 1809. End quote. What he means here is that people were justifying the actions that the country as a whole, Nazi Germany, took as a logical conclusion to injustices that had happened to Germany in the past. This is one of the problems of nationalism, that anything can be justified in the name of previous injustice. Mayer talks a lot about this so-called German spirit, and he wonders if there is something uniquely German that allowed the Holocaust to happen. A lot of this type of stuff is a little bit dated now by modern historians who point to the 70 years of post-war Germany as a, for the most part, bulwark of liberal values and democracy. But there is some important context here that Milton Mayer points out. Germans at the time period were deeply political, but they were also new to democracy. They didn't view themselves as the state like Americans tend to. And as a result of this, it might be possible to take less responsibility for the actions of your government. One person, a cabinet maker, according to Milton Mayer, said, quote, "It doesn't matter whether you call it a democracy or dictatorship or what, as long as you have discipline and order." End quote. We've now talked about a lot of the so-called reasons that potentially ordinary Germans went along with the Nazi regime. Maybe it was the ordinary nature of everyday actions lulling people into a sense of complacency. Maybe it was the cult of Hitler. Maybe it was the shirking of responsibility, moral justifications and excuses. Maybe it was simply the excitement that the Nazi Party could bring, especially to young people. Maybe it was for religious anti-atheism reasons or anti-communism. Maybe there was a sense of victimology. Maybe people simply benefited for economic reasons and were willing to overlook other bad things that the Nazis were doing. But I do think it's important to note that not everybody was fully on board. As we've talked about, a lot of people joined up with organizations or the party without actually believing in what the Nazis did. And some people found more substantial ways to resist and try to do the right thing. The teacher in town, Heinrich Hildebrandt, never liked the Nazis, but did end up joining the party in order to keep his job. He says that he did little things to resist. One time he assigned A Midsummer Night's Dream in order to have the kids listen to Jewish music and hopefully appreciate it. He arranged for a Jewish family's house to be bought by a so-called Aryan in order to keep it safe and protected. But he never shook the feeling that he could have done more. Indeed, he tells the story of his cousin who ended up trying to do more for the very family that Hildebrandt was trying to help. And he feels guilty because his cousin ended up getting killed by the Gestapo for her efforts. So some people in town did resist in small ways, but ultimately it wasn't enough. And it's important to remember in all of this talk of ordinary people doing ordinary things that lead to fascism and war and genocide, it's important to remember the victims. Whether this normalization process could have happened to anyone or not, the end result was millions of people dead. Heinrich Heine, a Jewish German, wrote a beautiful poem in the 1800s that ended up being prophetic. Quote, "Once I had a fatherland. The oak grew there so great, the violet so small and sweet. It was a dream that kissed me in German, and in German spoke the words, I love you. It was a dream."